Okay, so your client calls and says that the image is fantastic, but they want that flower around her neck to be blue instead of red. Obviously say you can do it, but the question is, how are you going to do it? Well, there's a bunch of ways in Photoshop that you can change the color of something. You can use the levels, curves, you could use a selective color, hue and saturation. In this case, because that red has to be spun all the way around to blue, pretty much the only command with that kind of power is the hue and saturation. So let's take a look at how that works. First off, we want it to be non-destructive, so I'm going to use a hue and saturation adjustment layer as opposed to doing it directly to the pixels. So from the bottom of my layers panel, I'm going to choose hue and saturation, and you'll notice that as I move this hue slider, the colors in the image change. So I'll pull this around until I see the blue that I want. The way this works, there's two spectra along the bottom. And as you work the slider, you'll see that the bottom one slides back and forth relative to the top one. The top one is telling you what the color was, so this flower that used to be red, you can see, has become blue. And there's the blue flower. Her skin tones, which used to be somewhere around here, are now purple. And there's her purple skin tones. Obviously the client's not going to be too pleased about that, so we've got to figure out how to get just the flower showing blue without her looking like some kind of weird freaky Smurf thing. Now you'll notice when we created the hue and saturation adjustment layer, there's a layer mask already connected to it. That's one of the nice things about adjustment layers. When you create one, they give you a layer mask because they kind of assume you want to apply it only in a specific area. Now right now it's white, which means that it's revealing the entire color changing effect of the adjustment layer. I could go through with black paint and start painting at all the areas where I want to bring the color back to its original, but that would take a long time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this layer mask with black. Easiest way, Command I or Control I on Windows inverts the layer mask. So white becomes black, it's all hidden. Now, I'm going to go in with a paintbrush and I'm going to load it up with white paint. When I'm painting on a layer mask, I want to make sure that I have pure black and pure white selected as my foreground and background. So I can click the default colors icon or simply hit D on the keyboard, and then I'll hit X to switch them around if I need to go from one color to the other. So I want white, and as I paint, you can see it reveals that color changing effect. Now, what I see a lot of people doing is they go in with a big soft brush and they start doing this, and they end up bleeding over top of the edge. Doesn't matter that much in this image because the background is kind of a neutral color anyway, but you can see it is changing it a little bit. If this had been a brighter color background, say a blue background or a green background, that overspray would cause a huge color shift back there. So we want a little bit more precision. Now, one of the things you'll notice in Photoshop, there's never a truly hard edge. There's always a transition from the object to the background. You'll never see where the object ends at this pixel and the background starts at that pixel. So we want to make sure that our brush has a transition that matches the transition of the edge. So if I choose a large brush, you can see that this edge is obviously much softer than that edge. By taking a smaller brush, say there, this edge is quite a bit harder than that edge. So I'm going to choose an appropriately sized brush. I'm changing the size of my brush from the square brackets to the right of the P key. And something around here seems to have a softness that matches the edge. And you can see that if I go right up to the edge there, I can change the color without bleeding too much into the background. Now this is also a good chance to use the shift clicking technique. You can see wherever there's straight edges, if I do a click up there, move down, hold the shift key and click, it jumps between the 2 points. So if there's a lot of wavy edges, easier to go in and do it by hand. If there's a lot of straight edges, shift clicking can work pretty good for you. So I'm going to work my way around the outside of this flower here. I'm not going to worry about the inner part because I'll take care of that once I've gone all the way around. Now you will notice that there's some problem areas. There's some shadows underneath the flower where you're getting some red showing up. I'll take care of those later as well. I'm only going to worry about the flower itself. I'll do kind of a quick job here. Normally you'd spend a little bit more time. You can see I bled over the background there, so I'll just hit X to get black, undo what I did, hit X again to get white, and continue along. So I'm working my way around the outside, not worrying about those shadow areas. I'll do kind of a fast job here. Again, there's the necklace here that's picking up some of those colors too. I'm not going to worry about that, but I'm also not going to leave a gap. I want a nice solid continuous line all the way around the outside. So I'm just cutting across the necklaces there. I'll deal with them later. Work my way around until I come back to where I started. Once I've made my way all around the flower, I'm going to take a look at that layer mask directly. If I option click on the layer mask or alt click on Windows, I can see that as a black and white image. I should have something that kind of looks like the outline of Australia there. Now this whole inner area I want to fill with white, but rather than using a paint bucket, which would leave a little bit of a fringe, I'm going to select the inner area, expand the selection, and fill it with white. So I'm going to grab my magic wand, one of the few times in Photoshop I recommend using the magic wand, click inside this black area, and you can see I get a selection that includes the black and some of the shades of gray. No matter how much you increase this tolerance, you're always going to have a little bit of a fringe around the outside. So if I were to fill this with white now, which would be the same thing as having used the paint bucket, you can see I get that little fringe which leaves some of that pink of the flower showing, some of that original red. We don't want that, so I'm going to step backwards, and I'm going to take this selection and I'm going to jump it outwards. And I'm going to do that by expanding it. So I'm going to go into the Select menu and choose Modify, because I want to modify my selection, and Expand. Now there's a bit of trial and error as to how far to expand it. If I'd used a larger brush, I would have to do a larger expansion. A smaller brush would have a smaller expansion. In this case, I think 6 pixels should do it. Let's see what happens. I'll hit OK. And that was pretty good. It could have gone a little bit farther, but that's good, as long as it's in that white area in the center. If it goes too far, it'll start clipping into the far side of that edge, and you'll get too hard of an edge instead of that nice soft transition. If you don't go far enough, some of this fringe will remain on the outside of the selection. But as long as this is somewhere in the white, we're good, so we'll choose Edit, Fill with White. Hit OK. Deselect, and let's take a look. Now sometimes in little V-shaped areas you might get an area that gets missed, because when it made the selection it selected the black, missed some of the gray, and when I expanded it, it didn't expand quite far enough. No problem, I'll just take my paintbrush, paint over it with white, and where I did my little test swipe over here, another problem area, no problem, I'll just paint over that with white. Option click on my layer mask again, and there's that blue flower. Now here's our problems around here. We've got some of this shadow showing up down below. In here, this is basically the red color from the flower getting reflected onto the dress. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my brush, drop my opacity a little bit. So I'm at 50%. I hit 5 on the keyboard to get 50%, and I'll just brush some of that blue color into the shadows there. Work my way around. You can see that kind of picks up the color of the flower. If this was a blue flower, it would be reflecting blue into the dress. Same thing around here. I'll bring that blue into these areas, underneath there. Now, under her jaw, underneath her chin there, that's going to be a little bit more problematic. We don't want to get an unnatural looking color, but it wouldn't pick up this red color, it would pick up the blue, but it would be a combination of the blue with her skin tones. So I'm going to drop my opacity a bit more, maybe 30–40%, and I'm using a fully soft brush. You can see I've always had the hardness pulled all the way down to 0, and I'm going to use the soft feathered edge of the brush. I'm not going to paint right across the color, I'm going to paint below it. You can see I'm going to be using the top half of the brush. If I click and drag, you can see that it just gradually brings a little bit of that reflected color into the chin there. Maybe not quite so far underneath, just up around there. A little bit of trial and error. Don't be afraid to use the Command Z to step backwards, or the Control Z. And if we step back, there's a little bit of a purplish around there, but that's kind of what you would get if that blue was reflecting into the chin. If it's too strong, again, you can hit X on the keyboard and gradually back it off a little bit. If you want to bring some more back in, hit X and paint over it again. So there's the original red, and there's the added blue. Now the nice thing about having used an adjustment layer for this, non-destructive, and you can edit it as much as you want. So if the client came back a week later and said, yeah, the blue is good, but we're wondering if you can make it green, no problem. I'll just double click on my hue and saturation adjustment layer here. You'll see the sliders right where I left it, and then in real time you can see that updating. You can also see the reflection in the chin changing and on the shirt. So make it the blue that they want, or the green, and let's say maybe they want it to match the shirt. You take the saturation, pull that down, and it'll match up with that shirt there. So a lot of control with the adjustment layers, the ability to go back, make changes, and if I turn off the eyeball, nothing is actually being done to the image. No pixels were damaged. So that's a nice way to change the color of things. Let's say someone's repainting a room, you want to try some different colors on the wall. Isolate the wall using a layer mask, throw on a hue and saturation, play around with the colors. You want to see what a car would look like in a different color, different shirts, things like that. Very useful and totally non-destructive. Remember to save it as a layered PSD so you can keep the editability of it, and then close her down.